Welcome to the third episode in our four-part series on Australian live cattle exports. In the previous episode, we took a look at live cattle hotspots around the country, and we also focused in on the value chain for live cattle exports, in particular looking at the reliance of participants within the value chain on their total revenues as a proportion of revenues attributable to live exports. Quite an interesting look at the dynamic there and showed the importance of the live cattle trade across most of the value chain. This webinar we're going to have a look at the Northern Territory as a case study. So we'll be focusing on regional employment across the Northern Territory and also finishing up the webinar with an assessment of the climatic factors that are important for producers within the region. So initially we took a look at the ABS data for the national agricultural workforce across various zones in the country. Now it's important to note that these percentage figures are the minimum levels that are attributable to agricultural workforce. It doesn't include the associated industries that work around the agricultural sector, such as transport or insurance or livestock agencies, businesses that employ people within the space but aren't strictly agricultural workers in the sense that they're on farm or producing crops or attending to livestock. So these are the minimum levels across these states, and if we do an expansion of the Northern Territory, which is where we're going to focus in on, we can see that the hotspot for the Northern Territory in terms of agricultural workers is in the middle eastern part of the country there at 19% of the workforce employed in agriculture, and just to the northwest of that zone we've got another hotspot just below the surrounds of Darwin there, between the 10 to 12% of the workforce attributable to agriculture within that zone. So if we have a look at the types of production systems operating within the north and focus in on the key ones, we can take a look at cropping first and the amount of hectares under cropping according to ABS surveys. We can see that really for the most of the state there's not a lot of cropping that goes on apart from those immediate areas around the vicinity of Darwin, and you're looking at around 73% of the area there under cropping. And then just further south to that, if we take a look at fruit and nuts, there's a zone just below Darwin there of around 39% of the area under a fruit and nut cultivation. But again, the remainder of the state for the Northern Territory, not much in the way of fruit and nut production. And nurseries, a similar picture, albeit slightly smaller proportions, but the area in and around Darwin at 0.1% of area attributable to nursery and nursery type production. So realistically speaking, for the majority of the state, not many of the agricultural workers could be anticipated to be working within any of these three sectors other than that immediate vicinity around Darwin. We do a similar look at livestock numbers and we can see that the number of pigs within the Northern Territory is only one real area to the northwestern part of the state that has some significant number of pigs, but certainly they don't constitute a commercially viable amount. And having a look at poultry numbers, again, almost all of the state virtually non-existent in terms of a production system. However, when we take a look at cattle and cattle numbers across the state, we can see some states that very highly reflect significant numbers of cattle, and certainly from previous webinars we know that those northern parts of the country in Northern Territory somewhere between 75 to 100% reliant upon live exports as part of that cattle industry. So if we bear that in mind and we take an overview of the agricultural workforce as a percentage of the Northern Territory and compare those particular zones to the cattle herd numbers, we can see a fairly clear correlation between the numbers of people employed in agriculture as a total and the cattle herd sizes. And that gives us a fair amount of confidence to say that the majority of those agricultural workers in those zones are quite likely to be employed within the cattle industry as a whole. And when we take into account the importance of live export within those regions to the cattle industry in terms of how many of those cattle are sold into live exports, then it's fair to say that the majority of that agricultural workforce would have a connection to the live cattle trade. And on the basis of that, we estimate that the number of full-time employed staff within the Northern Territory that could be attributed to the live cattle trade would be in the vicinity of 1,985 full-time equivalent hours being employed there in the north due to live cattle. Turning to the climate and more specifically the rainfall pattern within the Northern Territory, we've broken the state into a southern and northern region and took a look at the last 10 years worth of rainfall data from the Bureau of Meteorology, and then compared that to the last 100 years of rainfall data for those two northern and southern zones. And if we're focusing just on the southern zone for the moment, what's clearly evident in the last 10 years is we're seeing a higher level of variability across the whole of the season. So more pronounced kind of changes in rainfall patterns across that period. Certainly what would be traditionally the dry period through the middle of the year is becoming much more variable, and then the wetter season is also seeing much higher levels of rainfall. So it adds to that notion of variability. If we compare the 10-year southern data to the 100-year southern data, we can see a much more even pattern, and certainly around the wet seasons at the start and end of the year, they weren't quite as wet as what we're now experiencing. Contrasting the south to the north, we're seeing a much more pronounced wet and dry period in the north. However, if you look at the 10-year data, we can see that the dry period is becoming drier, and the wet period at the start and end of the season is becoming much wetter. And this just reinforces the general view across anecdotal evidence that climate is becoming much more variable and much more difficult to manage. And now that's an important factor for northern producers, as we've seen in previous webinars, that during drier times, live cattle trade has been able to act as a bit of an outlet for producers to offload stock and not saturate a domestic market with additional stock. So it's been able to act as a bit of a relief valve for the industry, the live cattle trade. If we were to remove the live cattle trade, hypothetically, obviously it would make it much more difficult for northern producers to be able to manage their climate risk in terms of these big events, in terms of dry periods or wetter than normal periods. But also through the season, through the general normal season, the live cattle trade allows a producer to vary their stocking rates according to the pasture on the ground, and to allow them to manage their pasture more effectively through the season. Now that we're starting to see more variability in climate across the Northern Territory, and indeed across the whole of the country, the ability to have the live export trade as a viable option to manage your stocking levels as a producer means that you're able to much better effectively manage your pasture in a more efficient, more environmentally friendly manner. So that's a factor that needs to be taken into account when considering the value of the live cattle trade from a risk management perspective for producers. It's a crucial part of the overall puzzle. So that concludes our third webinar in the series. In the final webinar 4, we'll be looking at the export sector overseas, and in particular zeroing in on the biggest export destination for our live cattle being Indonesia. Thanks for listening.